The night begins without hurry, moving the way water moves through a still garden. Patient, without shape, without need. The air carries no message, only quiet. You are invited to loosen the hold of the day, to let its weight slide away like sand between open hands. Thought slows, sound fades, and what remains is rhythm. The steady, unhurried pulse of being. Somewhere beyond reach, a door closes softly. A clock hesitates, forgetting its duty to mark time. The world exhales, and in that breath, calm returns. The voice you hear now drifts like water over smooth stones. It does not ask for attention, only company. There is no need to chase meaning here. You are not expected to think or to remember or to reach. This is the hour when effort dissolves. The walls of the room seem to widen, the ceiling higher. The air feels softer, almost endless. Every breath settles the mind, every exhale loosens what remains of tension. You are exactly where you need to be, between sound and sleep, between the fading light and the dark that welcomes. Here, time does not move forward. It drifts in circles, slow and forgiving. The moments no longer march, they breathe. You can feel the stillness begin to hum, faint and familiar, the way waves hum against a distant shore. The present becomes the only thing that matters, wide, deep, unbroken. The world outside grows pale and distant until even the memory of noise is gone. Tonight, two stories rise gently within this quiet. One belongs to a woman who was born far from power, who learned to rule an empire not through noise or conquest, but through composure. The Empress of Russia, whose strength was silence shaped into will. The other belongs to a dream that never existed, yet guided men across oceans and jungles. The shining mirage of El Dorado, a city made of gold, glowing only in the mind. Both are stories of reaching, of endurance, of searching for light in the long stillness of human desire. Let the voice guide you now. Let the night unfold the way memory does. Slowly, tenderly, without haste. The stories will come like waves, one after another, carrying you deeper into rest, until even history feels like sleep. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of thought, the world turns softly, waiting for morning. Catherine the Great. A distant birth. She was born on May 2nd, 1729, in a quiet corner of the Holy Roman Empire, where winters were long and the wind moved through pine forests like an ancient memory. Her name was Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst, a name that belonged more to lineage than to destiny. The house she was born into stood in the small German principality of Stettin, a place that rarely appeared on maps and almost never in conversation. Yet within those modest walls, the faint pulse of history had already begun to stir. Her family was noble, but only just. They held titles, but not fortune, influence, but not power. Her father, Christian August, served with quiet diligence in the Prussian army. He was a man of order and obedience, a soldier who believed in discipline more than ambition. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was the opposite, spirited, sharp, and restless. She dreamed of court life, of grandeur, of seeing her daughter move in worlds larger than their own. To her, life was not meant to be endured in silence, but climbed, one connection at a time, toward something brighter. Sophie grew between these two forces, her father's restraint and her mother's hunger. From him she learned composure, from her curiosity. She was often left alone for long hours, wandering through corridors lined with fading portraits and the faint scent of wax and dust. The servants whispered of how she read more than she played, how she asked questions no one could quite answer. Even as a child, she seemed to listen more than she spoke, as if she already knew that attention was a kind of power. Books became her first companions. She read whatever she could find: fairy tales, histories, letters from distant courts. She was drawn to the way language could shape thought, and how thought could, in time, shape the world. She practiced her handwriting until it was elegant and precise, the kind of hand fit for royal correspondence. Sometimes she stood before a mirror and tried to imitate the posture of queens from engravings, her small body wrapped in her mother's discarded silk. Not out of vanity, but curiosity. A quiet rehearsal for a role she did not yet know she would play. The winters in Zerbst were cold, candles burned early, and the sound of the wind against the shutters filled the silence between meals. In that stillness, Sophie learned patience. She watched her parents speak in low tones about politics and opportunity. She noticed how her mother's laughter changed depending on the rank of their guests. She observed, absorbed, remembered. Every gesture, every hesitation, every word left an imprint. She was not born to rule. No one in Germany spoke her name with expectation or awe. She was simply a bright, watchful girl from a small principality, clever, composed, and already carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew that life could be studied like a book. And yet, in the faint rhythm of her early years, the seeds of transformation had already been sown. Sophie would not remain a daughter of Zerbst. The wind that moved through those forests carried her name eastward, toward a vast empire waiting beyond the horizon, and toward a crown that, though unseen, was already turning slowly in her direction. The invitation to Russia. When she was 14, a messenger arrived from the north, from St. Petersburg, the heart of an empire wrapped in snow, ceremony, and distant light. The world he carried with him was unlike anything she had known. It was a place of palaces and processions, of golden icons and frozen rivers, where power spoke in whispers and silence was its own language. The Empress of Russia, Elizabeth Petrovna, was searching for a bride for her nephew, the young Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. Among the many names whispered in the drawing rooms and embassies of Europe, one emerged with quiet persistence. Sophie Friederike Augusta of Anhalt-Zerbst, a bright, attentive girl from a modest German principality, so small that most courtiers could not find it on a map. It was not destiny that chose her, but diplomacy. A union with Russia could strengthen fragile alliances, soothe rivalries, and remind lesser courts of their place. Yet to Sophie, the summons was not just another royal arrangement, it was the horizon opening. She understood, even then, that this was not merely a marriage proposal, but an invitation to transformation. Her mother, the ambitious Johanna Elizabeth, saw in it the fulfillment of every unspoken dream she had carried, the chance to see her daughter rise where she herself could not. She instructed Sophie carefully, urging her to charm, to listen, to adapt. Her father, Christian August, quieter and kinder, gave only a few words of blessing, knowing that he was sending his child into a world where kindness would be rare. And so, one winter morning, Sophie left the only home she had ever known. The carriage wheels turned over frozen ground, the air sharp with frost and the faint scent of pine. The sky was heavy and white, and the journey ahead seemed endless. Through the windows, she watched the familiar world recede, the small villages and grey fields of Zerbst disappearing behind her. In their place stretched the vast snow-covered lands of the east, a landscape both beautiful and forbidding. The days blurred together. Each night, She slept in borrowed rooms lit by weak candles, listening to the horses breathe outside, their bodies steaming in the cold. She wrote letters she would never send, wondering what kind of life awaited her beyond the edge of the continent. The people she met spoke in sounds she could not yet decipher, and she began to realize that language, like power, could divide as easily as it could unite. When she finally reached St. Petersburg, it was as if she had stepped into another universe. The city glittered beneath the winter sky. White palaces along the frozen Neva, golden domes rising above the mist, sleighs gliding through streets lined with light. Everywhere there was movement and stillness at once, grandeur layered upon silence. The court was unlike anything she had imagined. Its beauty was deliberate, almost theatrical. Courtiers bowed with perfect grace and smiled with practiced restraint. Behind every gesture was intention, behind every compliment, calculation. Sophie quickly understood that in this place, survival was not guaranteed by birth, but by perception. To belong, she would need to become someone new. She began by learning the Russian language, repeating each phrase until it became part of her breath. Her tutors described her as relentless, a girl who studied by candlelight long after lessons were meant to end. She filled her notebooks with unfamiliar letters, each curve and line an act of surrender and of will. Slowly, Russian began to replace the rhythm of German in her thoughts. She learned the rituals of the Orthodox Church, its hymns, its icons, its silences. The ceremonies felt foreign at first, but in their weight and structure she sensed a kind of truth, a rhythm older and deeper than any she had known. She practiced the gestures of devotion not as performance, but as adaptation, understanding that in this new world, faith was also a language of belonging. In the spring, she was received formally into the Orthodox Church. The moment was solemn and still. The air smelled faintly of wax and smoke, the light of 100 candles trembling against the gilded walls. When the ceremony ended, she was given a new name, Catherine Alexeyevna, and with it, a new life. Those who stood in the church that day might not have noticed the transformation. The change was quiet, almost invisible, but complete. The name Sophie became a shadow, a distant echo of a past already dissolving. Catherine stood in her place, composed, attentive, and entirely awake to the enormity of what she had begun. She did not weep for what she left behind. She understood instinctively that survival depended on letting go of softness. In the mirror, she practiced stillness, the calm face that revealed nothing. She spoke carefully, listened more, and watched everything. Even then, she was learning her first and most important lesson in empire. That power begins not with command, but with transformation. By the time her marriage to the Grand Duke Peter was arranged, the girl from Zerbst was gone. What remained was the outline of a woman who had already begun to shape her own myth, one that would grow with time until it eclipsed all others. In her heart, Catherine carried both the ache of exile and the quiet certainty that she was meant for more than obedience. The snow outside the palace windows fell endlessly, covering the past, softening the world. And, somewhere beneath that silence, a new story began. The story of a girl who learned to rule first over herself and then over an empire, top of form, bottom of form. A marriage of silence. Her husband, Peter III, was a man of distractions, restless, impulsive, and uncertain, as though he had been born into a role he neither wanted nor understood. He spent his days absorbed in trivialities, his attention darting from one fancy to the next. The court expected command, he offered performance. In the grand halls of the Winter Palace, he surrounded himself with toy soldiers, small brass cannons and wooden fortresses painted in bright colors. He would spend hours arranging miniature armies across tables, recreating battles from his beloved Prussia. To him, war was a game of imagination, not consequence. He laughed too loudly at his own victories, sulked at imagined defeats, and paced the marble floors like a restless child who could never tire enough to sleep. Catherine, watching from the distance that had already grown between them, understood early that affection would not blossom in this marriage. She had entered the palace as an outsider, determined to belong. Yet what she found beside her was a husband who seemed determined to remain a boy. Their marriage was a union of title, not of heart. The corridors that echoed with ceremony and music offered no warmth. Behind the grand dinners, the masked balls, and the endless rituals of etiquette, there was a profound silence. Not peaceful, but hollow. Catherine learned to carry herself like a statue that could breathe. Her movements were deliberate, her smiles measured. She spoke when spoken to, laughed when required, and withdrew before curiosity could follow her. In a palace crowded with eyes, she learned the art of invisibility, not by vanishing, but by blending so perfectly into the fabric of court life that she became part of its pattern. There were moments when she felt herself dissolving into that stillness, as if the act of survival required erasing the self. And yet, somewhere beneath that quiet, something within her remained awake. The palace itself was beautiful and lonely in equal measure. Its corridors stretched endlessly, gilded and echoing, filled with portraits of rulers who watched from the past. Outside, the river froze in winter, turning the world to glass. Inside, gossip moved like smoke through rooms heavy with candlelight. Every conversation was a transaction, every friendship a strategy. Catherine learned to listen without answering, to collect words the way others collected jewels. Silence, she discovered, was its own kind of language, one that the foolish never noticed until it was too late. At night, when the corridors emptied and the fires dimmed to embers, she turned to her secret refuge, books. She read by candlelight until her eyes ached and the flame trembled. Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire. Voices from another world, alive with ideas that dared to question order and tradition. In their pages, she found what her marriage lacked: companionship, reason, and hope. They spoke of liberty, justice, and the power of thought, things no court could grant and no emperor could take away. Those books did not make her rebellious, they made her patient. They taught her that power was not noise or command, but clarity. To rule, one must first understand not only others, but oneself. The philosopher's words filled the silence of her rooms and gave shape to the future she did not yet name. Slowly, her isolation became a kind of training. She began to see her confinement not as punishment, but as preparation. Peter, meanwhile, drifted further from reality. He mocked the Russian court, sneering at its customs and dismissing its traditions as backward. He idolized Frederick of Prussia, a man he had never met, imitating his manners and military obsessions. While Peter played at soldiering, Catherine studied soldiers. While he laughed at courtiers, she learned their loyalties. He sought amusement, she sought meaning. He ignored the people, she began to study them, their language, their hopes, their habits. Each day she learned something new about the empire that would one day be hers to hold. The distance between them widened, but her composure never faltered. To those around her, Catherine appeared calm, dutiful, perhaps even indifferent. But beneath that calm was motion. slow, deliberate, unseen. She began to understand that strength need not reveal itself to exist. Power, real power, was quiet at first. In those years of silence, Catherine trained herself. She learned how to wait without losing purpose, how to observe without judgment, how to endure without bitterness. She became fluent not only in Russian speech, but in the language of restraint. Every insult she ignored, every humiliation she endured, was stored somewhere deep within her, not as pain, but as knowledge. What began as endurance slowly transformed into discipline, and discipline into vision. She learned to mask her thoughts behind serenity, to let others underestimate her. In the long, cold winters of her marriage, she cultivated the qualities that would one day define her reign: patience, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of timing. When Peter raged, she remained still. When he boasted, she listened. When he stumbled, she smiled. And through it all, she grew, quietly, steadily, invisibly. The young woman once chosen for her obedience was becoming something else entirely, a student of power. By the time the court began to whisper her name with a different kind of respect, Catherine had already changed beyond recognition. She no longer needed affection or approval. The loneliness that had once haunted her had become her greatest teacher. Each night, as the candles burned low and the sound of her husband's laughter echoed faintly down the corridor, she would turn a page and whisper the words of the philosophers under her breath. In their reflections, she saw herself more clearly than ever before. She did not yet know it, but the lessons learned in those quiet years would guide her through revolutions, betrayals, and the long arc of power itself. What began as survival had become transformation. Beneath the surface of a loveless crown, Catherine's purpose took root, silent, patient, and inevitable, the steady awakening of an empress. The coup and the crown. Years passed, and Catherine's patience became her shield. Life at the Russian court unfolded like a slow procession through fog, glittering yet fragile. Behind every smile lay suspicion. Behind every toast, a hidden motive. Catherine moved quietly through it all, never rushing, never revealing. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she acted, and waited for the current of history to turn in her direction. In early 1762, the inevitable arrived. Empress Elizabeth, who had ruled with energy and extravagance for 2 decades, fell gravely ill. The palace grew tense and hushed, its corridors filled with whispers and flickering candles. When Elizabeth finally died that January, the throne passed to her nephew, Peter of Holstein, Gottorp, now Emperor Peter III. The crown, meant to restore stability, instead unsettled the empire. Peter was 34 and still carried the immaturity Catherine had known since their youth. He worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy, and openly admired Prussian customs. Within months, he alienated nearly everyone: the Orthodox clergy, the nobility, the army. He withdrew from a victorious war against Prussia, humiliating Russian soldiers who had fought for years. He mocked Russian traditions, replaced officials with foreigners, and filled the court with reckless laughter and careless insults. To many, it seemed Russia had traded dignity for absurdity. Catherine stayed silent. Outwardly, she performed her role as Empress Consort with composure. Inwardly, she began to prepare. Her intelligence, restraint, and quiet dignity earned her something far more valuable than affection: trust. Those disillusioned by Peter began to see in her a different kind of ruler: calm, rational, dependable. She did not need to ask for loyalty. It came to her naturally, drawn to her stillness. By spring, Peter's recklessness had turned dangerous. He spoke openly of divorcing Catherine, even of sending her to a convent. The words reached her ears through servants and courtiers, but she showed no reaction. She understood that emotion would betray intent. Instead, she strengthened her alliances, beginning with the Imperial Guard, the most powerful force in Russia. Among its officers was Grigory Orlov, young, confident, and deeply devoted to her. Their relationship had grown from affection into quiet partnership. Through Orlov, Catherine began to measure the heartbeat of the army. She knew which regiments were restless, which commanders were ready. Every message was delivered in whispers, every meeting disguised as coincidence. The empire was a vast web, and she was beginning to pull its threads. In June 1762, the balance tipped. One of her allies was arrested, and word reached her that the conspiracy might soon be uncovered. There was no time to hesitate. Before dawn on June 28th, Catherine was awakened in her chambers at the Winter Palace. The rain outside was soft but relentless. Orlov stood before her, pale with urgency. "It must be now," he said. She rose without panic. Dressed in a simple riding gown of black and silver, she left the palace quietly, escorted by a small group of guards. The carriage wheels rolled through the sleeping city, their sounds swallowed by fog. St. Petersburg, unaware of the storm forming within its own heart, lay still beneath a sky of muted grey. Her destination was the Izmailovsky regiment, loyal, disciplined, and already sympathetic to her cause. When she arrived, soldiers lined the courtyard, half awake, uncertain of what was unfolding. Catherine dismounted her carriage and stood before them, her expression calm, her voice steady. She declared herself not a wife betrayed, but a sovereign chosen by duty. She promised order where there was confusion, strength where there was weakness. The soldiers listened. Then, almost as one, they dropped to their knees. Their loyalty shifted in a single breath. Catherine's calm became command. From that moment, the empire no longer belonged to Peter III. The news spread with impossible speed. Regiments throughout the city joined her cause. Bells rang across St. Petersburg, seen not in alarm but in recognition. Crowds poured into the streets, shouting her name. When Catherine rode through the city in the green uniform of the Imperial Guard, her composure and confidence erased all doubt. She was not a usurper. She was the answer to chaos. Peter was at his summer residence in Oranienbaum when he heard. At first, he refused to believe it. He laughed, dismissed the rumors, and drank heavily. Only when a messenger arrived with the truth, that the army, the clergy, and even the people had sworn allegiance to Catherine, did his defiance fade into panic. He fled toward Kronstadt, hoping to rally the navy, but found the harbour closed to him. The sailors, too, had pledged their loyalty to his wife. Surrounded and abandoned, Peter surrendered without resistance. Within days, he signed his abdication, renouncing the throne. A week later, he was dead, officially of illness, though few believed it. Rumors of strangulation circulated quietly, carried by servants who dared not name their sources. Catherine never confirmed nor denied the story. She spoke of him only once, saying softly, "He is no longer necessary." The coup had lasted less than a day. No armies clashed, no cities burned. Power shifted as quietly as the turning of a key. Catherine had achieved what few in history had, a near bloodless revolution led not by violence, but by understanding. She had measured her moment perfectly, and when it came, she took it with grace. Her coronation followed that summer in Moscow. Beneath the golden domes, the ceremony unfolded with solemn beauty. Catherine knelt before the altar, her hands steady as the imperial crown was placed upon her head. The choir sang, the nobles bowed, and cannon fire echoed beyond the city walls. To the world, she was now Catherine II, Empress of all Russia. But when the crowds dispersed and the music faded, she returned to her chambers alone. The night was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of candle smoke. From her window, she could see the reflection of the moon on the Neva River, pale, shifting, alive. It reminded her of herself, once distant, now luminous, yet always moving beneath the surface. She did not smile, she did not weep. She simply sat in the stillness and listened to the faint murmur of the city below. Her city now. She knew that seizing power was only the beginning. Holding it would demand far more. Yet she felt no fear. She had walked through years of isolation, humiliation, and silence to reach this moment. Nothing frightened her anymore. Outside, the guards kept watch, their boots echoing faintly across the marble floors. Inside, the new empress exhaled slowly, as if testing the weight of her new name. Catherine the Great. Not yet by title, but already by measure. And as dawn crept gently over St. Petersburg, the empire stirred under new rule. The candles in the palace flickered, the bells tolled once more, and Russia, vast, silent and waiting, began to breathe in time with its new sovereign. The shape of rule. Catherine's reign began not with thunder, but with the quiet discipline she had always carried within her. When the crown touched her head, she did not see it as a symbol of triumph, but as a responsibility to restore order to a realm that had lived too long in uncertainty. Russia, vast and restless, needed structure, and she, at last, had the power to give it shape. For 34 years she ruled, decades of snow and harvest, war and ceremony, silence and grandeur. She would become one of the most enduring rulers of her time, both admired and misunderstood, both a dreamer and a realist. Her empire stretched over forests and steppe, across rivers and seas, and yet she governed it from rooms lit by candlelight, her thoughts travelling farther than her body ever could. From the beginning, Catherine spoke the language of reason. The ideas of the Enlightenment had reached her long before she took the throne. She had read them in secret, in the candle-lit years of her marriage. Now they became the foundation of her vision. She wanted to modernize Russia, to bring it closer to Europe, to raise it from superstition toward knowledge. She admired Voltaire and Diderot, wrote to philosophers, debated ideas of justice and governance. Her letters moved between palaces and salons across the continent, carrying her belief that wisdom could civilize even the coldest empire. She began her reign with reform. Laws were rewritten, commissions established. She summoned noblemen, lawyers, and scholars to advise her on how to shape a new code of justice, one based not on fear, but on reason. In 1767, she convened the Nakaz, or instruction, a vast document outlining her vision of enlightened rule. In it, she spoke of equality before the law, the protection of life and property, and the rejection of torture. It was, in its way, a promise that Russia could become not only strong, but fair. But ideas, she learned, were lighter than reality. The nobles who filled her court nodded and praised her intellect, yet clung fiercely to their privileges. The bureaucrats, cautious and corrupt, slowed every reform with hesitation and delay. The peasantry, bound to the land, remained voiceless, their lives measured by the harvest and the whims of their landlords. Catherine wanted to lift them, but she needed the nobility to keep the country stable, and stability, she discovered, had a cost. Her reforms turned cautious. Where she had once dreamed of emancipation, she began to defend control. The same laws meant to modernize often reinforced hierarchy. Her words still spoke of freedom, but her hands were busy maintaining order. Russia was too vast, too wild, too fragile to experiment with sudden change. She could not afford chaos. She had taken the throne through quiet precision, and she meant to keep it the same way. Beyond the capital, her vision extended outward. She expanded Russia's borders with deliberate ambition, south to Crimea, west into Poland, east towards Siberia's endless forests. Each conquest was not only territory, but security. Each treaty a line drawn against the uncertainty of Europe. In these years, generals marched in her name, cartographers redrew the edges of the known world, and foreign courts spoke her name with a mixture of awe and calculation. She ruled not from the battlefield, but from her desk, a ruler of ink and intention. Reports from the provinces arrived daily, taxes, births, rebellions, weather. She read them all. The empire's rhythm became her own. In St. Petersburg, she turned her attention to culture. The city, still young and carved from marshland, began to glow under her rule. She built schools for girls, libraries for scholars, and theatres for the nobility. She believed that beauty was a form of order, that art could teach people how to live with grace. Painters, architects, and musicians found patronage under her reign. The Hermitage Museum, born from her personal collection of art, became a symbol of her mind, vast, curious, endlessly expanding. Her court, too, became a place of spectacle and subtlety. Diplomats described it as both magnificent and disciplined. Balls glittered beneath chandeliers, but behind the music, Catherine's attention was constant. She listened to conversations, weighed gestures, remembered everything. Power, she believed, was not in domination, but in understanding. To know people was to rule them. Still, the contradiction within her deepened. She had risen through courage and reformist hope, but the longer she reigned, the more she saw the fragility of her throne. Revolt was never far. In 1773, when Pugachev's rebellion swept through the Volga region, led by a man claiming to be her late husband, Catherine faced the harsh truth of empire. The uprising was brutal. Villages burned, armies clashed, thousands died. When it ended, she tightened her grip on power. The dream of freeing the serfs dissolved into the smoke of rebellion. The peasants, she decided, were not ready for liberty. Or perhaps, she admitted privately, Russia itself was not ready. Her vision became tempered by caution. The language of enlightenment remained, but its light grew softer, more selective. She continued to correspond with philosophers, but she no longer followed their every principle. When revolution erupted in France, she condemned it, horrified by its violence, its disregard for tradition. Once, she had admired reason above all. Now she saw that reason, untethered, could destroy the very order it sought to improve. Catherine had become what she once studied, a monarch who understood that survival required compromise. She protected the nobility to preserve stability. She censored some ideas to prevent disorder. She balanced progress with patience, reform with restraint. Her empire became a living paradox, enlightened yet autocratic, cultured yet unequal, thriving yet still haunted by the silence of its peasants. Yet within that contradiction lay her genius. She never mistook control for cruelty nor intellect for virtue. She ruled with calculation, but also with humanity, a kind that expressed itself not in sentiment but in endurance. She worked tirelessly, sleeping little, reading everything from reports to novels. Ministers who underestimated her often found themselves replaced before they understood why. She was neither warm nor cold, but constant, a steady pulse at the heart of an empire that demanded both strength and subtlety. By the end of her reign, Russia had changed beyond recognition. The empire was larger, richer, more organized. Its culture had flourished. Its administration, once chaotic, had found rhythm. Catherine herself had become an institution, the embodiment of Russian rule, both feared and revered. Yet she remained, in her own view, only a student of history. She knew that empires rose and fell not with battles, but with the quiet erosion of will. So she continued to work, to write, to plan. Even in her final years, she drafted new charters, reviewed education reforms, corresponded with thinkers across Europe. Her energy never waned, only deepened into stillness. In her study at the Winter Palace, the candles burned low. Outside, snow drifted across the frozen Neva. Inside, the Empress wrote in her precise, slanted hand, shaping words that would outlive her voice. She had once been a girl from Zerbst, overlooked, underestimated, sent to marry a foreign prince. Now she ruled 1/6 of the world's land, yet the lesson she had carried since childhood never changed. That power, like silence, was strongest when steady. The same woman who had dreamed of reform now guarded the walls of stability. The same voice that once spoke of freedom now ensured control. Between those two truths, she found her balance, the shape of rule that bore her name. And in that balance, she discovered the final secret of power, that to hold it is not to possess, but to endure, top of form. The quiet legacy. Catherine's life closed as it had been lived, in quiet command. By the time she died in 1796, she had ruled for more than 3 decades, shaping Russia with a steady, deliberate hand. The empire she left behind was vast, powerful, and complex, bound together by the force of her will. She was admired and judged in equal measure. To some, she was the embodiment of reason, a monarch of vision and intellect who brought light to a once isolated empire. To others, she was a symbol of contradiction, the reformer who defended hierarchy, the woman who spoke of liberty yet ruled by decree. Both versions were true, and neither could contain her fully. Her letters to philosophers, her policies, her art collections, her alliances, and her loves all became fragments of a legend that blurred fact and fascination. In every portrait, she seemed calm, composed, unshaken, a ruler who had learned to carry solitude as easily as power. Yet beneath the grandeur, Catherine remained what she had always been, a student of time, of people, of the quiet forces that shape history. She understood that empires, like memories, survive not through noise but through endurance. When her reign ended, Russia stood larger and more confident than ever before. But her true legacy was quieter, the still echo of a mind that never stopped observing and a will that refused to fade. El Dorado. The whisper of gold. Far from the marble corridors of Europe, beneath a sun that burned rather than shone, another dream was taking shape. It was not carved in stone or inked in royal decrees. It began as a murmur among trees, carried on the humid air of the South American highlands. A story older than maps, softer than truth. They called it El Dorado, the Gilded One. Before it became a myth of cities and crowns, it was a man, a ritual, a shimmer on water. In the high plateaus of what is now Colombia, the Muisca people told of their ruler, a young chief anointed with sacred oils and powdered gold. When the morning came and the mist still floated above Lake Guatavita, he would step onto a raft woven of reeds. Around him stood priests and attendants, holding torches that flickered against the mirrored surface. The lake was still, the color of polished stone. As the raft drifted from shore, the golden dust on his skin caught the first light, glowing like fire. He carried treasures, emeralds, gold figures, ornaments, offerings, not wealth. One by one they were cast into the depths. The lake received them without sound. When the last gleam vanished beneath the water, the ruler washed himself clean and returned to land, purified, renewed, luminous no more. For the Muisca, this was not greed, but balance. Gold was the sweat of the sun, sacred, living, never meant to be owned. What mattered was the act of release, not possession. Each offering was a reminder that beauty held meaning only when it was allowed to disappear. But across the ocean, the story changed. When whispers of the ritual reached Europe, they shed their quiet purpose and grew wings of desire. Merchants, sailors, and soldiers all heard of the Golden Man and imagined not a ceremony, but a kingdom. A city covered in gold, streets gleaming beneath the tropical sun, temples crusted with jewels. The imagination of Europe, restless and hungry, reshaped a ritual into a promise. To men who had crossed seas and storms for fortune, El Dorado became more than legend. It was justification. It explained their hunger. It forgave their violence. Somewhere, they believed, beyond the green walls of the jungle, lay perfection waiting to be claimed. The story spread like fire through letters, taverns, and royal courts. Each retelling stretched the map farther. Some said the city stood near the Andes, others swore it was hidden by Amazonian mist. For every explorer who failed, another arose, convinced the last had simply turned the wrong way. They named rivers after hope, mountains after despair, valleys after loss. In their pursuit, they cut through rainforests that swallowed men whole. They fought rivers that turned against them, insects that hummed with disease, nights so black they seemed to erase the world. They watched comrades vanish into quicksand, fall to fever, or dissolve into madness. And still, the idea of gold endured, untarnished, eternal. Back in the villages where the wind carried no rumors of empires, the people still told their story of the Golden Man. But they no longer recognized what the strangers sought. The meaning had drifted, like dust scattered in sunlight, from reverence to desire, from ritual to conquest. In the quiet of the forest where vines crept over forgotten paths, the truth remained as it always had been. A man once covered himself in light, not to be worshipped, not to be found, but to honor the earth that gave him life. The Europeans never understood this. They only heard the whisper of gold, not the silence that followed it. The search begins. When the conquistadors arrived in the New World, the sound of the word El Dorado moved through their ranks like wind through dry grass. It was not spoken in their language, but it needed no translation. To men who had crossed oceans in search of fortune, it meant one thing: promise. Yet what they imagined was not the quiet ritual of a golden man on a raft, but an entire city, a kingdom made of gold, hidden somewhere within the unending green of South America. They had come from lands already tired of conquest. Spain was rich, but restless. The age of discovery had turned into the age of hunger. Gold from Mexico and Peru glittered in the hands of kings, but for the soldiers who carried swords across the seas, there was never enough. So when the tale of El Dorado reached them, first as rumor, then as conviction, it was not curiosity that filled them, but desire. They saw in the jungle not danger, but destiny. The first to chase the legend was Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, a lawyer-turned-explorer who set out from Santa Marta in 1536. He led 800 men into the interior, following rivers that twisted like serpents through heat and silence. They dragged their cannons across swamps, their horses sinking in mud. Each day, the jungle thickened, swallowing sound. Armor rusted in the humidity, maps blurred with rain. Men who had dreamed of treasure began to measure their wealth in water and breath. Months passed. Fever spread. Yet when they reached the high plateaus of Colombia and saw the shining ornaments of the Muisca people, Quesada's heart quickened. He believed he had found the source of the story. The gold ornaments, the fine woven cloth, the rituals near Lake Guatavita, everything seemed to confirm what rumor had promised. But there was no golden city, no palace shining in the sun. There were only villages and people who valued gold as symbol, not currency. Still, the myth refused to die. Quesada returned to the coast with a handful of gold and the certainty that more awaited elsewhere. Others listened and believed what he could not prove. Soon the map of South America filled with marks of hope, mountains where the city might stand, lakes that might hide its reflection, rivers that might lead to its gates. Every failure seemed to point to another possibility. Next came Sebastián de Belalcázar, who marched north from Quito, and Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conqueror of Peru, who set out eastward. Each expedition began with ceremony, banners raised, prayers murmured to heaven. Each ended the same way, with silence. Men wandered for years through jungles that offered no return. They fought each other as often as they fought nature. The forest took everything, horses, armor, men, and gave back only illusion. Francisco de Orellana was among the few who made it out alive. In 1541, he drifted down a river so vast that he thought it could only be part of the sea. He named it after the warrior women he believed had attacked him, Amazonas. He never found El Dorado, but his journey gave a name to the world's greatest river and extended the legend's reach. For if no city of gold had been found, surely it was only because it lay deeper still. The years passed and the dream grew heavier. Maps became collections of guesses decorated with drawings of temples and suns. The cities of Europe echoed with tales of men who had vanished into green eternity. To some they were fools, to others saints of ambition. Poets wrote of them. Kings financed new voyages. Even as one expedition after another ended in death, the myth remained untarnished. Gold, after all, cannot rust. There was something about the jungle that invited obsession. It did not reject the intruders outright. It consumed them slowly, almost gently. Vines crept over armor, footprints filled with water, and disappeared. The air shimmered with heat and insects, carrying the scent of decay and blossom alike. Every direction looked the same, and yet every explorer believed he stood on the edge of discovery. In 1560, Pedro de Ursúa led 400 men from Peru to search for El Dorado once more. His companion, and later his killer, was Lope de Aguirre, a man whose name would become a shadow across history. When the expedition faltered, Aguirre mutinied, declaring himself Wrath of God, Prince of Freedom. He murdered his superiors, seized control of the journey, and proclaimed war against both the jungle and the empire that had sent him. He would find El Dorado, he said, or burn the world trying. He found neither. Months later, surrounded and delirious, Aguirre was captured and executed. His body was quartered and scattered, but his madness lived on in legend. To later generations, he became the embodiment of the curse of El Dorado, the man who believed so completely in gold that he became consumed by it. The centuries moved on, the Spanish crown turned its attention elsewhere, yet still rumors persisted. The city shifted places, sometimes north, sometimes south, sometimes said to lie beneath a great lake, sometimes at the heart of a mountain. The story adapted, surviving every disappointment. It was no longer a destination but a direction, a promise that the next expedition would succeed where all others had failed. As time passed, even science joined the chase. In the 17th and 18th centuries, naturalists and cartographers traced the old routes, measuring rivers and valleys. They found traces of ancient civilizations and roads carved into the earth, terraces that had once fed thousands, pottery and gold dust buried beneath layers of soil. These discoveries deepened the mystery rather than resolved it. Perhaps El Dorado had been real once, a city swallowed by time and forest. Perhaps the myth was a memory, not an invention. In Europe, the story took on another meaning. Painters depicted shining cities half lost in mist. Writers used El Dorado as a symbol for human desire, that endless reach for something just out of grasp. To dream of gold was to dream of perfection, of purpose, of redemption. Even those who no longer believed in the literal city could not resist its echo. Back in South America, the lakes remained silent. Lake Guatavita still held its secrets, its waters heavy with silt and sunlight. From time to time, new explorers arrived, their equipment modern, their reasons less divine but equally curious. They dredged the lake, finding fragments, gold dust, ornaments, small offerings, enough to prove the ritual had been real, never enough to satisfy the dream. The jungle, patient as ever, reclaimed what was disturbed. The trees grew back over the camps, the rivers shifted course. Birds returned to the quiet sky. The men who had searched for a city of gold left behind only their names carved faintly into the bark of time. And still, somewhere in the mind of humanity, the search continues. The myth of El Dorado is no longer about geography, but about longing, the need to believe that somewhere, just beyond reach, there is a place where all loss is undone. Armor rusted, maps lied, the forest took more than it gave, and yet the search never stopped. For in the hearts of those who wander, the whisper of gold remains, not the sound of treasure, but the echo of hope itself. The endless journey. The story of El Dorado did not end with failure. It transformed, adapting like mist to every new horizon. For centuries, the promise of gold continued to breathe through the ambitions of men. Expedition after expedition set out, each one convinced they were closer than the last. No defeat was final. Every silence seemed to whisper of another chance just beyond reach. They came from Spain, from Portugal, from England and France. They came with banners and muskets, with faith and fear, with maps drawn from rumor and the kind of hope that blinds the mind to reason. Some followed rivers that wound endlessly through the heart of the continent, their currents thick with mud and light. Others crossed mountains where the air itself grew thin, where even the sound of breath seemed to freeze before it reached the ground. Each man carried within him an image, not of a place he knew, but of a place he wanted to believe existed. They dreamed of golden walls rising from jungle mist, of temples shining beneath a merciless sun. They imagined a king robed in light, his people adorned in gold dust, the earth itself gleaming with wealth beyond imagination. In truth, what they sought was not a city, but the fulfillment of desire, a moment where the world would finally give back what it had taken. They marched for months, then years, armor rusted, boots rotted, horses sank in rivers that looked calm until they swallowed everything. The forest closed around them, endless and indifferent. It smelled of decay and rain, of sweet flowers that bloomed over death. Men who had once spoken of conquest began to mutter prayers. Their banners, once symbols of empire, hung limp and wet. When they found villages, they demanded directions, but no one could give what did not exist. The people of the forest knew what the strangers were looking for and watched with quiet understanding. They had seen it before, the madness that came with gold, the hunger that never ended. To them, the earth was not a treasure to be taken, but a living thing to be respected. The foreigners did not understand this. They heard only what they wanted, the echo of their own longing. Some expeditions reached great lakes, their waters smooth as mirrors. They thought they had arrived, that perhaps beneath the still surface lay the reflection of El Dorado itself. They built rafts and drifted out to the center, throwing ropes and anchors into the depths, as if gold might rise to meet them. But the water gave nothing back. Others climbed mountains that scraped the edge of clouds, believing the city must lie above the reach of mortals. Yet when they reached the summit, there was only silence, the kind that humbles and unmakes. From those heights, the jungle looked infinite, a green ocean stretching forever. Some wept, others turned on one another. The dream, too bright to hold, began to fracture. Few returned. Those who did spoke in fragments, their voices changed, their eyes distant. They spoke of rivers that shone like metal, of stars reflected in the water, of voices in the night that sounded almost human, or perhaps only memory calling them home. Some swore they had seen the city from afar, a golden glimmer through the mist, gone when the sun rose. Others said they had touched it, a single wall, a single statue, before it vanished like smoke. Historians would later call these accounts delusion, but perhaps they were not lies. The mind, when pushed beyond endurance, begins to see what it most desires. For those men, El Dorado had become not a destination, but a vision born of exhaustion and faith. In their hunger and their fever, they found what they were searching for, not in the jungle, but in themselves. The map-makers of Europe filled their parchments with these stories. Rivers curved into impossible shapes. Mountains shifted with each retelling. Every blank space on the page seemed to glow with possibility. For centuries, the unknown was not something to fear, but something to pursue. El Dorado moved across the map like a phantom, retreating whenever someone tried to pin it down. It was said to lie in the highlands of Peru, then in the jungles of Brazil, then deep in the Orinoco basin. Always ahead, always further. And still they came, soldiers, scholars, missionaries, and wanderers. Each new expedition began with ceremony and ended in silence. Ships vanished, letters stopped, families waited for news that never came. The jungles of South America became graveyards of ambition, the earth reclaiming everything with patient grace. Yet the dream endured, because failure too became part of the myth. Every loss added weight to the legend, every disappearance made it more sacred. The more impossible El Dorado seemed, the more it proved itself worthy of belief. The idea began to shine brighter than any gold could. By the 18th century, El Dorado had already outgrown geography. It was no longer confined to rivers or mountains. It lived in the imagination, an emblem of longing, a metaphor for the unreachable. Poets wrote of it as a place the soul yearns for, but can never find. Philosophers used it to describe the endless pursuit of perfection. Explorers spoke of it even as they doubted it, because to stop searching was to admit the emptiness of the journey itself. And so the story changed again. What had begun as a rumor became a pilgrimage, a movement of spirit as much as of body. Men no longer sought the golden city for wealth, but for meaning. To chase El Dorado was to confront the vastness of the unknown, to test the limits of endurance, and to feel for a moment the raw edge of existence. In the end, no one ever found the city because there was nothing to find. El Dorado was never a place. It was an idea, an inheritance of longing passed down from one generation to the next. It was the quiet spark that keeps people searching even when the world tells them to stop. It was the dream that lives beyond disappointment, the hope that transforms failure into faith. Perhaps that is why the story endures still. Not because gold was ever buried in the earth, but because something precious is buried in the human heart. A need to believe that there is always more to discover, always something shining just beyond reach. The forest, eternal and indifferent, keeps its secrets. The rivers flow on, carrying fragments of the past beneath their mirrored surfaces. And somewhere between truth and illusion, the legend drifts, not as a lie, but as a mirror. It reflects what humans have always sought and always lost, the shimmer of meaning in a world too vast to fully understand. El Dorado was never found because it was never meant to be. It exists still, not in gold, but in the endlessness of the search, the journey that has no destination, only the quiet promise that somewhere within the act of seeking, we are already home. Top of form. Bottom of form. Top of form. The truth beneath the leaves. Centuries passed. The fever of conquest cooled. Empires that once sent ships across oceans began to crumble, leaving behind only stories, and among them the most persistent of all, El Dorado. For generations it survived as myth, a whisper in libraries and taverns, a cautionary tale wrapped in adventure. Yet the jungle, vast and patient, remembered differently. Beneath its canopy, time did not erase, it concealed. When archaeologists and scientists returned in the 20th century, they came not as conquerors, but as listeners. Their instruments replaced swords, their curiosity replaced hunger. They walked where rivers once carried galleons and where trails of conquest had long since vanished beneath green silence. What they found did not glitter in the sunlight. It was subtler, deeper, quieter. They discovered signs of design hidden beneath the forest's skin. Straight lines visible from the air where there should have been chaos. Circles, mounds, and geometric patterns too precise to be nature's work. These were not accidents. They were the bones of something forgotten, the outlines of roads, plazas, and irrigation channels. Beneath centuries of vines and roots, the Amazon revealed the faint memory of structure, of civilization. Soil scientists digging where explorers once dreamed of gold found something even more extraordinary, a kind of man-made earth known as terra preta, or dark earth. It was rich, fertile, and unlike the natural soil of the Amazon, which is thin and poor. This black soil had been created intentionally centuries before the Europeans arrived through the careful layering of charcoal, compost, pottery shards, and organic waste. It was a quiet technology, built not for glory but for survival. And it lasted. Even after hundreds of years, terra preta still held its strength, nurturing trees and crops long after the hands that made it were gone. This discovery rewrote what many had believed about the Amazon. It was not, as early explorers claimed, an untouched wilderness, but a garden tended by countless generations. The forest itself, they realized, might be partly human in shape. What had seemed natural was, in truth, cultural. The living legacy of forgotten civilizations who understood the rhythm of the land better than their conquerors ever would. Further surveys using aerial mapping and LIDAR technology began to reveal even more. Beneath the canopy were networks of roads and settlements stretching for miles, connecting clusters of habitation like constellations. Some were the size of small cities, others simple clearings, but together they painted a picture of complexity. A society that had once flourished across the basin. Not a single golden capital, but many centers of life, woven together like threads in a vast tapestry. The old stories, it seemed, had never been entirely wrong. The conquistadors, driven by greed and fever, may indeed have glimpsed something real. Not a city of gold, but the fading glow of a civilization already wounded by disease and disruption. By the time they arrived, European illnesses had swept ahead of them, carried by trade and contact, devastating entire populations before swords were ever drawn. What the explorers saw, distant fires, abandoned villages, the echo of grandeur, may have been the last light of a world already collapsing into memory. It is a quiet irony. The myth of El Dorado, born from misunderstanding, may have preserved the shadow of truth. There had been richness there, but not of metal or jewel, richness of knowledge, of cultivation, of coexistence with the earth. The treasure was not something to seize, but something to learn from. The archaeologists who studied the dark earth spoke of it almost reverently. It was evidence that humans could build abundance without destruction, that civilization need not leave scars to prove it existed. In their quiet camps under the canopy, they unearthed pottery, tools, bones, the ordinary traces of lives once lived fully. Every fragment told the same story. People had thrived here, peacefully, intelligently, for centuries, and so, little by little, the image of El Dorado began to change. It ceased to be a place of gold and became something softer, a metaphor, a memory, a mirror. The Golden City was never meant to be found. It was meant to remind. It spoke not of possession, but of the longing that drives all exploration, the search for meaning, for proof that the world holds something more than the visible. For the people who first told the story, the Muisca, the builders, the gardeners of the forest, gold had never been currency. It was the sun made solid, a symbol of connection between human and divine, earth and sky. When they offered it to the lake, they were not surrendering wealth. They were completing a circle. To give back was to remain whole. The Europeans, blinded by their own reflections, could not understand this. They mistook reverence for abundance, generosity for excess. In chasing the myth, they missed its lesson. That value does not always shine. The explorers returned home empty-handed, but their failure was not the end of the story. It was its continuation. Because myths that endure do so for a reason. They reveal what truth alone cannot. Now, standing in the same forests centuries later, scientists speak softly of the people who once lived here. Their cities may have vanished, their names forgotten, but their influence endures in the soil itself, in the way the forest grows, in the invisible architecture of roots and rivers. The myth of El Dorado was never a lie, it was an echo, a reflection of human longing, refracted through time, reshaped by misunderstanding. What remains beneath the leaves is not gold, but memory, fertile, alive. The explorers who dreamed of wealth saw the surface, but not the essence. They sought treasure and missed wisdom. The civilizations they dismissed as primitive had already mastered the balance between creation and care. Their legacy was not one of empire, but of equilibrium. In the end, El Dorado exists not in maps, but in the soil, in the dark earth that still breathes beneath the roots of the Amazon. It exists in the reminder that the truest riches are those that sustain, not those that shine. And perhaps that is the final truth. The myth of El Dorado endures because it tells a story larger than gold. It tells of humanity's endless desire to find something greater, and its equal blindness to what already surrounds it. The explorers were searching for a city. What they found, without realizing, was a reflection of themselves. Their ambition mirrored the sun they chased, bright, blinding, and fleeting. The jungle remains. Its silence holds both the loss and the lesson. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint murmur of the past beneath the leaves. The sound of civilizations breathing through time, the echo of hands shaping the earth, the memory of a people who understood that true wealth is what you give back to the world. The gentle lesson. In the end, the search for El Dorado was never truly about gold. It was never about the shimmer of metal or the weight of treasure locked away in the heart of a jungle. It was about something far quieter, the longing that drives human beings to move, to imagine, to reach for the unseen. For centuries, the name El Dorado lived like a small flame in the minds of explorers, scholars, and dreamers. It flickered through the maps of empires, through the poetry of discovery, through the dark halls of ambition. And though it led many to ruin, it also revealed something timeless, the endless capacity of the human spirit to hope. Each expedition that set out for the Golden City began with a promise. The air would fill with the sound of hammers striking wood as ships were built, the rustle of paper as maps were drawn, the murmurs of prayers before departure. The men who sailed did not think of failure. They thought of light, of gold reflecting on water, of glory that could outlast death. Even when they faced jungles that seemed alive with resistance, they believed that with just a little more effort, one more river, one more horizon, they would arrive. That belief itself became their compass. But El Dorado was not a place. It was a direction, one that pointed inward as much as outward. The explorers never knew it, but their journey through the wilderness mirrored a journey through their own desires. The further they went, the less they saw the world around them, and the more they saw themselves, their fear, their hunger, their pride. The jungle became a mirror of the mind, vast, tangled, beautiful, and merciless. Some returned empty-handed and broken. Others disappeared entirely, their names lost to vines and silence. Yet all of them contributed to the myth, to the long thread of human yearning that connects ages together. Because what they sought was not the gold itself, but what gold represented: permanence, certainty, something untouched by decay. They wanted to believe that somewhere, hidden from time, there existed a place where beauty and meaning did not fade. Over the centuries, the story of El Dorado softened. It ceased to belong to soldiers and kings. It became a tale told by travelers, a metaphor whispered by philosophers, a dream painted by poets. It began to mean something different, not a city of gold, but a feeling that glows in every act of seeking. The map became a reflection of the heart, filled with promise, but never complete. Every age has its own version of El Dorado. For some it is wealth or power, for others discovery, love, or peace. It takes many forms: a horizon, a voice, a light behind the fog. And like the explorers of the past, we follow it without always knowing why. We walk into the unknown not because we are certain of what we will find, but because the act of seeking gives us life. The jungle that swallowed the conquistadors was not cruel. It was simply patient. It watched men search for what it could never give, and it waited. In the end, the gold that could be mined, melted, or carried away was only a distraction. The true treasure lay in what the search revealed. The explorers came face to face with the vastness of the world and the smallness of themselves. In the quiet moments between struggle and surrender, they glimpsed something rare. The stillness that comes when all illusions fall away. The story of El Dorado teaches this softly, that not every journey needs a destination. Some exist only to show us how far we are willing to go for something we cannot name. The value of the path lies not in its end, but in the depth of its silence, the way it humbles the heart, the way it teaches patience, the way it invites acceptance. When we chase the idea of perfection, of the unreachable, we are repeating the same old story under new stars. The gold may change form, an empire, an invention, a dream, but the longing remains. And just like the explorers, we often discover that the thing we were searching for was not somewhere out there, but quietly waiting within us all along. Perhaps that is why the myth never dies, because it belongs not to history, but to the soul. Each generation in its own way sets out toward an unseen city, hoping to find peace, purpose, or glory. And though the paths differ, the truth remains the same. The world offers no final treasure, only the invitation to keep walking, to keep wondering, to keep dreaming. At the end of the long search, when the rivers grow still and the torches fade, there comes a moment of understanding, a gentle one. The realization that the map was never wrong, only misread. That the gold was never hidden in the earth, but scattered across every sunrise, every breath, every quiet act of endurance. The explorers spent their lives searching for a city that could not be found, because it was never a city at all. It was the calm that arrives when the heart stops grasping. The lesson of El Dorado is not about failure or triumph, it is about surrender. The peace that comes when one stops reaching for what glitters and begins to see what glows. In the hush, after centuries of searching, that is what remains, a gentleness that outlasts ambition. And so the story ends not with discovery, but with stillness. The forest remains eternal and alive. The rivers move softly through the places where men once dreamed of gold. Somewhere beneath the canopy, the dark earth still holds traces of their footsteps, not as scars, but as reminders. Because in the end, what they truly found was not El Dorado, but themselves. And the quiet truth that all searching, when carried far enough, leads not to gold, but to peace. Two stories. One of a woman who rose from the small, cold rooms of a German province to rule a vast empire of ice and fire. Another of a myth born from mist and ritual, drifting through the green silence of the Amazon. They are separated by oceans and centuries, yet bound by the same invisible thread, the quiet restlessness of the human spirit. Both reached beyond what was given, and both discovered in their own way the cost of such reach. Catherine the Great sought order in a world built on chaos. She reshaped a nation with her mind, her discipline, her patience. Her victories were not loud but deliberate, the slow turning of a wheel that would outlast her. She ruled for 34 years, building schools and laws, expanding borders and ideas. Yet even she, with all her intellect and ambition, stood often in the solitude of power. A reminder that to hold the world in one's hands is to feel its weight in silence. El Dorado, by contrast, was never flesh and blood. It was a reflection, a story cast on water and carried by wind. It drew thousands into the jungle and left them with nothing but the echo of their own longing. The city of gold was never found because it was never a place. It was the shimmer of hope itself. A mirror to every human heart that believes there is always more just beyond the horizon. Catherine reached upward toward the height of rule. The explorers reached outward toward the edge of the known. Both were driven by the same pulse, that quiet defiance of limitation, that desire to transform the ordinary into something eternal. One carved her name into marble and policy. The other left no monument, only the ghost of a dream that still glows faintly in the stories we tell. As the night deepens, their worlds drift together, empire and legend, reason and myth, dissolving into the same soft stillness. What remains is not their triumph or their failure, but the quiet rhythm of persistence, the sound of humanity breathing through time. The understanding that history is not a sequence of endings, but a pulse that continues beneath everything, steady, unseen, enduring. So let the stories rest now. Let Catherine's marble halls and the green forests of El Dorado fade into the half-light of memory. Let the gold turn to dust and the crowns to silence. What endures is gentler. The thought that every life, every myth, every empire is a single breath in the long exhale of time. History does not end. It waits. It listens. It breathes quietly through those who still remember, through those who, even in stillness, keep searching for the light behind the silence.